NEWSLINE.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of NEWSLINE. I'm Shehan Ranatunga, sitting in for Faraz Shaukat Ali, who is currently battling a bout of the flu. And I know you join me as we all wish Faraz a speedy recovery. He'll be back with you soon, hopefully even tomorrow. Also, we'd like to inform you, viewers, that NEWSLINE tomorrow night will be on TV1 at 11:30 p.m. But if you are unable to catch that episode on TV1, you can always visit the Newsfirst page on YouTube. That's Newsfirst Sri Lanka. Simply search for NEWSLINE and you will have all the latest episodes right there. So you need not miss a single episode. Now this evening on the program, I've got with me a frequent guest on NEWSLINE, Mr. Nilandan Niruddhan. He is a defense and political analyst. Good evening, Nilan.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Nilan, right, to kick things off, you were on this show just recently, about 2 months ago, and we talked about the situation with Sri Lanka's relations with the big three, India, China and the United States. Now, the situation in the country is, well, as we all know, we're in a crisis, particularly an economic crisis. Where, in your assessment, where do we stand now? Has the situation changed much in terms of our relations with these countries? How far have we come, in your opinion?
So we are still more or less in the same situation that we were in the last time I was on the show a few weeks ago. I wouldn't say that geopolitically much has changed from our side. However, this week has been a very interesting week for the world as a whole. So we have Xi Jinping in Saudi Arabia, which might herald the kind of first real shift of the Saudis towards the Chinese. We can discuss that. We have the Mahsa Amani protests in Iran. We have protests in China, with China now going back on the zero COVID lockdown policies. We finally have some kind of closure on the US midterm election results. So it's been quite an eventful week globally.
That's right. Thank you, Nilan. And as you said, let's break down those topics you just suggested. Let's look first of all at the situation in China. Now, there have been protests in China, and following these protests, there has been an immediate reaction from the Chinese government as they eased COVID restrictions there. What's your reading on this situation, Nilan?
Yeah, so look, in general, we are in very interesting times when it comes to China. As we discussed the last time I was here, Xi Jinping looks like he has a huge control over the party's infrastructure at the moment. And this has been his first kind of real slap in the face since he consolidated power. Because what we need to remember is that even though the Chinese population typically tends to be very loyal to the leader, all it takes is a few backs for these guys to go back to square one. And if you look at the zero COVID policy, so people with COVID being forcibly taken to quarantine camps, people with COVID being forcibly locked inside their own houses, with even the fire exits being blocked, and people dying inside these buildings when there are earthquakes and there are fires. The public are very angry at a lot of ancillary stuff that's happened because of the zero COVID policy. So they're quite sick and tired of that. And yesterday, the Chinese government announced that it was reversing large parts of the zero COVID policy. So China, as you know, has been under almost complete lockdown for about a year now, and most foreigners can't even visit most regions in China. And hopefully all of that will ease now. But economically, politically, culturally, these are very difficult times for China.
Do you really believe that these protests will challenge the Chinese president? Just recently, the Chinese Communist Party confirmed him as the party leader, which meant that he will remain the China's president. Do these protesters really affect him?
It won't affect him in the short run, but it will affect him in the long run. So what happens is, in China, as you know, many of these macro narratives are important because they're big believers in history. They're big believers in historical trends. So while it might not harm Xi Jinping right now, in terms of his overall consolidation as the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong, or maybe even more than Mao Zedong, all of these small factors will play in, because with China's system, you need to remember that entire system is built on the presumption that your population will listen to you. That entire system is built on that one assumption. If that crumbles, the entire Chinese political system crumbles. So he can never rest easy with things like this.
You mentioned his visit to Saudi Arabia. Why is that significant?
So he's in Saudi Arabia right now because as far as the Saudi-US relationship is concerned, it's at a historically low point. Mohammed bin Salman, in some ways, is a controversial figure because when you look at him in one way, he's a great visionary who can probably take Saudi Arabia to the next level geopolitically. But on the other hand, because of the Jamal Khashoggi murder and stuff like that, he's a very controversial figure. So this Chinese visit is a direct slap in the face to the Americans. I would say just look at the international news coverage. Look at how Xi Jinping is being received. He's being given a red carpet welcome in Saudi Arabia. Whereas if you contrast it with Joe Biden's arrival in Saudi Arabia in his last visit, where Mohammed bin Salman just gave him this reluctant fist bump and the two of them never really got along, it's quite clear that we are at a very, very pivotal moment. I mean, in many ways, Mohammed bin Salman is correct to side with China because the United States is moving towards alternative energy like wind and solar and all that. And yet they want the Saudis to keep producing oil so that the American economy can use oil until it doesn't need oil anymore. In which case the Saudis will simply be left with a whole bunch of oil and nobody to buy it. So Mohammed bin Salman knows that he needs to take Saudi Arabia in many different directions, not just economically, but geopolitically as well. So we might be witnessing a Saudi-China friendship that the Americans are simply not ready for. So that's the reason for Xi Jinping's visit, to capitalize on this growing gap between the Saudis and the Americans.
Well, speaking of the Saudis and the Americans and China, now is there a shift in the power center, do you think? Taking also into account the recent US elections and what we saw there, and we now know that Donald Trump is once again in the picture, where do you think that stands?
So the US midterm elections, if there had been a conclusive result to this, I could have probably given you a better answer. But the results have been very close. The Democrats have finally, it looks like they've won the Senate because of the Georgia result that just came out. The Republicans have control of the House. As you were saying, Trump's back in action. Now Trump says that he wants an audit of all the weapons and equipment that was sent to Ukraine, because he knows that most of those weapons that were sent to Ukraine have just been distributed among the Ukrainian people now, and you're not going to be able to get it back. So the US is still firmly the world's power. The US is still firmly the primary geopolitical player in all our considerations. However, with Joe Biden at the helm, and I think we've discussed this before, one has to admit that many of these things would not have happened, such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Many of these things would not have happened if Trump was still in power. And I guess your question was, has there been a decrease in American geopolitical power, right? Was that the essence of your question?
That's right. That's right.
So I don't think there's been a reduction in their power at its essence at all. But there are, once again, dark days ahead, unfortunately, for both the Americans and the Chinese.
Now, you have the Americans, you have the Chinese. Now, something you touched on is the situation in Russia and Ukraine. Now, this also plays a significant part in, well, food security, the cost of fuel. What's your assessment of the situation there? When is this going to end?
So where do I put what?
When do you think the Russia-Ukraine conflict will end?
Okay, so right now it looks like it might take at least 2 years for some kind of resolution if they keep fighting. A few days ago, we had the American State Department officially saying, look, you guys need to go for talks. Day before yesterday, on the French side, we had Macron also saying, look, we have to go for talks. Unfortunately, the Ukrainians don't seem to have learned much from their victories, as in they seem to have become a little too arrogant because they put up a good showing against Russia in their own territory. So day before yesterday, as I'm sure you know, Ukraine launched an attack on Russian military bases, hundreds of kilometers inside Russian territory. And yesterday was the first time we saw the US government openly condemn the actions of the Ukrainian government. They were like, come on, you can't use the weapons that we are giving you to attack the Russians inside Russia. We are giving you these weapons to defend yourself against Russian invaders who enter your country. But the Ukrainians are now using these weapons to launch attacks into Russian territory. And as far as nuclear deterrence policy goes for Moscow, they are now well within their legal right to consider a nuclear retaliation, which is why even Washington had to condemn the Ukrainian attack. So while there are many big players asking for cease talks because they can see that this conflict is going to go on for a couple of years if talks don't happen soon. While they are doing that, Ukraine's conduct, unfortunately, does not seem to warrant a ceasefire at any moment now.
This war, as you said, well, you think it will take about 2 years now. We're into the winter season. How does this affect the conflict? Does anyone have an advantage? Many people thought that the Russian president would have ended things by now, but it's dragged on this far. Will the fact that we're in the cold winter now play any role in the outcome of this war?
Yeah, so the Americans claim that a bad winter will be bad for Russia, and it makes sense, right? Logistically, keeping supply chains open and things like that is always going to be much harder during winter. That's just been a fact of war throughout the history of warfare. However, one of the major weapons that the Ukrainians have been using against the Russians has been the HIMARS anti-aircraft missile system. These HIMARS systems, and I'm sure many of our audience members have heard of this as well, have been extremely devastating against Russian aircraft. And the HIMARS systems might not function that well during the peak of winter because we've not really seen the HIMARS playing a huge role in the last 1 or 2 weeks, and that might be the reason for it. So even though conventionally it would be much worse for the Russians, right now what the Russians are doing is they are also attacking the energy infrastructure of the Ukrainians. So Americans are accusing Moscow of weaponizing winter. So that's the official term that the US State Department is using. What they say is that Russia is weaponizing winter as in attacking the energy infrastructure of Ukraine to make sure that most of Ukraine has no heating, to make sure that most of Ukraine has no electricity, and to let them all suffer and possibly even die through the winter. So while the conventional stance is that the winter is worse for Russia, because of Russia's targeting of Ukrainian energy infrastructure, the winter is going to be devastating for the Ukrainians as well.
Thank you, Nilan. We'll cross over now for a short commercial break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Trade unions and mass organizations protest against the budget. Professionals threaten to protest if unjust taxes are not lifted. President stresses the need to increase the electricity tariff.
ජනප්‍රිය නොවන තීන්දුව ගන්න තියෙනවා. ඒ ගන්න තීන්දුව නිසා අනාගතේ හොඳ වෙන්න යනවා.
Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna trade union condemned president's policies.
කොළඹින් ඡන්ද ලක්ෂ දෙකක් ගන්න බැරි වෙච්ච රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහ අද මේ රටේ ජනාධිපති වෙලා ජනතා පරමාධිත්වය පිටුපාලා මේ රටේ තියෙන ජාතික සම්පත් විකුණන්න කටයුතු කරනවා.
Indian smog makes its way to Sri Lanka. Election Commission ready to call nominations for the local government election.
Newsfirst, NEWSLINE.
Welcome back to Newsline. You're with me, Shehan Ranatunga. Joining us tonight on the program is Nilandan Nirudan. He is the defense analyst, a political analyst as well. Good evening, Nilan. Welcome back to the show.
Good evening. Good to be back once again.
We looked at the situation in Ukraine and Russia. We looked at the situation in China, the US before the break. Now let's switch our attention to what's happening in Iran. Now, there have been protests following recent incidents that transpired there, and following the protests, we had recent news from Iran that there was a possibility that the Iranian authorities would remove the morality police there. However, that's yet to be officially confirmed from the government. What's your reading on the situation in Iran?
Yeah, so look, once again, I am quite skeptical of the Iranian government's claims that the morality police is going to be disbanded. I think what will happen is kind of what's been happening in Iran for a while, which is that even though a morality police exists, it's usually not enforced. It's only enforced in very rare occasions these days. Iran is not as restrictive as it was, let's say, even 10 years ago. However, the morality police still do arrest people. And that's what happened to Mahsa Amani as well, right? A 22-year-old girl who was arrested. She was allegedly beaten to death in police custody. And that has sparked a protest. There are a couple of factors here that we need to keep in mind. The first is that Iran is not like Saudi Arabia in the sense that Iran does not have reliable global partners. So Saudi Arabia has the United States, historically at least. Iran has never really had, they've had partners like Turkey and China and all that, but never really someone who can bail them out of these situations where you have not only a law and order crisis, but also a diplomatic crisis. So Iran will have to liberalize, at least in terms of women's rights. And we could be at the cusp of something much bigger as well, because once the morality police is gone, it's not going to stop there. Because right now, the feminist activist circles in Iran, they are riding a high wave at the moment. They have public enthusiasm behind them. They have public support behind them. So hopefully, we will start seeing more measures in favor of the emancipation of women in Iran. And hopefully, we will witness some kind of secularization of their laws happening, because Iran really needs it. Right now, with Saudi Arabia so geopolitically strong and strangling Iran almost, Iran has to do something to connect with the rest of the world. Iran's relationship with India used to be good just 2 years ago. It's not that good now. Iran's relationship with China used to be good just 2 years ago. It's not that good now. Iran's relationship with Russia used to be good, but I mean, Russia has bigger problems now, and they might sell Iran somewhere down the line for their own gains. So Iran has to integrate into the international system. And the first thing that they need to do is get rid of many of these oppressive theocratic laws. And hopefully this is the first step in that path.
When you look at what's happening in Iran, in China, look at what's happening here in Sri Lanka, there's an increasing number of young people in particular, isn't there, Nilan, stepping out, challenging political authority, trying to get make their voice heard. Is this something that has picked up, particularly over the last 10 years, you'd say?
So I would say Occupy Wall Street in 2008, 2009 was probably the forerunner of many of these things. As you pointed out, over the last 10 to 15 years, throughout the world, we have seen constant kind of social movements where people mobilize. Even just before COVID broke out, the Shaheen Bagh protests in New Delhi in India, Hong Kong protests against the one law system in China, protests in the United States over the George Floyd murder. Even before and during COVID, there were many of these social movements, and we are a great example. Sri Lanka is a great example of that really creating political change. So yeah, we are in a new era where this has become a method of political mobilization, where the age of social media and really the interconnectivity that a lot of people crave for, you kind of kill two birds in one stone, where you have your kind of social dynamics sorted, but at the same time, many of these people also feel like they are a part of a bigger cause and a better cause and all that. So this form of young people coming out, protesting against specific issues. In India itself, you've had about 4 or 5 of these in the last, 2-3 years in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh. South Asia is a hotbed of these things over the last 4 years, as is the West. So yes, this is the future of political activism.
And if I can just add to what you just said, would you say that there's a shift in a global form of governance and conventional politics?
Sorry, what was that?
Would you say that there's been a shift now in a global form of governance and conventional politics? It's a change. It's a sea change from how it used to be.
So I would say there's a globalization of values. There's been a globalization of methodology in terms of how you protest against the government. So in terms of, you can look at protesters in Latin America, protesters in South Africa, protesters in Sri Lanka, protesters in China, protesters in Indonesia. So what's happened is the methodology, the methods that they use have all become the same, but I wouldn't really call it any kind of globalized or synergistic model beyond that, because in terms of their actual political objectives, all these movements are vastly different. So there's been a globalization in terms of the way in which protesters go about doing what they want. We had the Arab Spring almost a decade ago, if you remember, but I don't see this translating to anything policy related.
Earlier you touched on energy infrastructure, Nilan. Could you tell us how important is it, in your opinion, for Sri Lanka to overcome this energy crisis, and who should we go to get help? Because let's face it, Sri Lanka needs help from its international partners.
Look, our problem is that we can't pick one friend and stick to them, right? So it's kind of difficult for us to decide who we need to go to when we ourselves are so fickle. Singapore decided to go with the United States. Japan decided to go with the United States. South Korea decided to go with the United States. Saudi Arabia decided to go with the United States. And all these countries have benefited greatly by being steadfast allies of the United States. So you reap the benefits of a global system when you are willing to take a side and pick it. Whereas we have always been famous for flitting around from one side to another. Even in the 60s and 70s, one government would be pro-West, one government would be pro-communist. So as a nation, we have diplomatically not made any long-term friends whom we have stuck with over the long run. So that question, unfortunately, is unanswerable given our history.
So then my next question would be, seeing that we are in this historic position right now, and by historic I mean we have not been in this sort of a severe crisis before, at least not to this extent. Is it time that we pick a side, do you think?
So if we pick China, should we be concerned? Is that what you're asking?
Well, yes, I suppose you could turn the question in that way. Should we pick China?
I mean, look, I personally would say no, because China is very much like the British Empire in terms of it being mercantilist, right? So we have to remember that there are two different ways in which great powers interact with small powers. There's capitalism and there's mercantilism. The British Empire, it was a mercantilist empire in that it was based on extracting resources from the colonies. Whereas the American system is a capitalist system where they go in and infuse economic growth so that they can then sell their products to these new people. The Chinese are a mercantilist force. If you look at what they've done in almost any country they've played a big role in, it's all been extraction of resources, taking large parts of land, giving these countries huge amounts of money as debt and asking for resources as collateral. They've not really helped any of their partner countries build wealth the way that the Americans did with Japan and South Korea and Saudi Arabia and all that. So purely because of the extractive nature of China's politics, I don't think a country like Sri Lanka should pick China as its only partner.
Thank you, Nilan. We have to cut you short there, although there's plenty more questions I can ask you. We must now cross over to the Prime Time News. But thank you for joining Newsline. And with that, we wrap up tonight's show.
Thank you for having me.